Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all here. My name is Barbara Fry, and I am a newish member of the Tegeter Committee, a great group of volunteers who helps to organize. Louder, okay. You're speaking to the right person. Anyway, my name is Barbara Fry, and on behalf of St. Francis Cabrini and the Tegeter Talks, I would like to welcome you to today's presentation about migrants in our state and migrants in our country at a time when this issue is quite a politicized issue. We thought it would be a good moment to think about our role in that scenario as people of faith. The Tegeter Talks are presentations that are made on critical subjects that challenge and inspire us in our Catholic faith. And the Tegeter Talks honor the legacy of our former Cabrini pastor, Father Mike Tegeter, who cared deeply about dialogue on topics of social justice and faith. Mike was the pastor of Cabrini from July 2011 until ill health forced him to step down on Easter Sunday 2016. This was a very tumultuous time for the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, and Father Mike was very clear in his commitment to speaking the truth as he saw it. And for any of you who doubts that, I invite you to go to the Cabrini website where we have, there's a collection of Father Mike's blogs that he used to put in the bulletins every Sunday, and it's quite a walk through memory lane and through the issues of the day. So the topic of today's talk, Harboring Hope, our role in the journey of migrants and refugees, seems also appropriate because St. Francis Cabrini is named after Mother Cabrini, who, as most of you know, was an advocate for immigrants in the last century, and now a star of film and screen, apparently. She's become quite the movie star in a new movie featuring her work. Pope Francis, addressing the Global Refugee Forum this past December, reiterated his belief that the plight of refugees is a shared responsibility. We are all called to create communities that are ready and open to welcome, promote, and accompany and integrate those who knock on our doors. To this end, the Pope also said, we must acknowledge that being a refugee should not be a mere granting of a status, but a recognition of a full God-given human dignity. As members of the same human family, each individual deserves a place to call home. That means having food, access to healthcare and education, and dignified work. So the topic fits very well in our Catholic social justice tradition, and we're so pleased that you're here to join us and that you're here to hear our speaker, Sarah Brenes. Before I introduce Sarah, let me just say that the Tegeter community is one that runs partly on volunteer donations, and I think that our greeters have already let you know that. So after the talk, we'll be passing a basket. Please donate, or those of you who would rather, you can donate on your phone. You can go to St. Francis, you go to cabrinimn.org and click on donate, and you'll get a link to the place where you donate for the Tegeter Talks. So thank you for your support in that way. So now to our speaker, Sarah Brenes, who is the executive director of the Binger Center for New Americans at the University of Minnesota Law School. Sarah is a specialist in immigration and public interest law practice with a focus on holistic client services and intraprofessional collaboration. I'm lucky to have known Sarah for the past couple decades prior to her Her work at the Binger Center, she was practicing immigration law at the Advocates for Human Rights and was the director of the Refugee and Immigrant Program for the last many years before the Binger Center recruited her to come over and work with students at the University of Minnesota Law School. Her legal training and formation was rooted in interprofessional clinical education while studying and teaching at the University of St. Thomas School of Law and its Center for Counseling and Legal Services, along with another colleague of ours, Virgil Wiebe, who some of you might know at St. Thomas. While she was at St. Thomas, appropriately enough, Sarah received the John R. Roach Fellowship in recognition of her commitment to public interest law. So we're so delighted, Sarah, to have you and for you to be able to take us further into understanding this important issue of migration. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Brenes.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Barb, and thank you all for coming. The weather looks very nice outside, so extra appreciation for taking a respite indoors for a bit. As Barb mentioned, I practice immigration law previously, the last decade, fairly intensively, running a nonprofit, the legal services side at the Advocates for Human Rights, where we primarily work with asylum seekers, human trafficking survivors, unaccompanied children. So it was a very busy time while I was there, and now get to work with students, and I really appreciate this opportunity since I'm not working as day-to-day with clients, but really being able to step back and look at the context of the migration issue, what's happening now, what's happened in our country in relation to immigration. So I titled the presentation Harboring Hope because it's fairly hard to come by on the issue of immigration these days, and in addition to my commitment, my New Year's resolution to find fun things to do, which it really helps balance. Also just trying to find hope in all the work that we're doing, because that's the only way we can continue to move forward. So I wanted to start with a little poll for the audience. How many of you are immigrants here in the audience, born yourself in another country? How about children of immigrants, grandchildren, and leaning back, great-grandchildren? All right. So many of us in the room have ancestors who were immigrants here in a land, and perhaps some also who are ancestors to those indigenous to the United States. And odds are, for those who weren't born here, there are three main drivers that have driven migration of human beings in the history of our existence, primarily family, food, and freedom, whether it be fleeing somewhere in order to search for freedom, or maybe being taken from somewhere in the case of slaves that were brought to the United States by forced migration and had the freedom taken from them. But for as long as we've existed, humans have moved and migrated when conditions at home are no longer adaptable. And this was accepted as normal until the rise of the nation state and the creation of political borders. Ownership and access to land became the duty of the nation state to decide who could have land, who could be on the land, who could use its resources, and that was determined by each country and having that right to do it. And that's where a lot of our immigration law comes from. So with this in mind, as Barb mentioned, the hot button issue right now is borders, but I just want to make clear that border security is not migration policy. I was asked to talk about borders, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. Underneath the surface is a deep mass of migration policy that for the history of the United States has been built on racism, xenophobia, and economic exploitation. I won't go into the long history from the beginning, but a few highlights or lowlights from the most problematic features of our modern immigration laws in the United States. First of all, unless you have $500,000 and can create some jobs, establishing a business, the path to immigration in the United States is not easy. Professionals must show they're extraordinary in their field, or if you are simply good enough, you need to show that you're not going to take a job from a US citizen. Immigrants are typically held to a higher standard than US citizens are and the general human being. For marriage-based cases, you must know things like the color of your spouse's toothbrush, exactly how many shoes they had, or where you went on your last date. These are actual questions that happen in marriage-based petition interviews with our US Citizenship and Immigration Service. And on the application for permanent residence, there's over 50 questions that constitute reasons, if you say yes to any of them, might trigger you not being admitted to the United States. And there's a whole separate section of immigration law with 52 reasons that you could get kicked out after you're admitted. And that includes 35 different offenses and categories of offenses that constitute aggravated felonies, several of which are not considered felonies at all under state criminal law. Things like failing to appear in court or filing a false tax return. And those we often call, if you have an aggravated felony, it's the kiss of death in terms of immigration, because once you're deported with an aggravated felony, there's really no path back. If you commit a crime, you must pay double. Most immigrants who've committed crimes serve their time in criminal court and then end up in immigration detention and could be facing deportation as well and having to defend their right to stay here, all the while being oftentimes separated from family. And to become a US citizen, you have to pass a civics test, and there are some studies that say only 1 in 3 US-born citizens would be able to pass that test. And when we think about our humanitarian immigration laws, and these are laws that were created for victims of violent crime, survivors of human trafficking, those that are fleeing persecution, the burden is on the applicant to prove that their suffering was enough to constitute persecution, such that they're worthy of the ability to live in the United States. Victims of crime have to prove that they are going to cooperate. They're going to face the perpetrator in criminal court if the prosecutor decides they're going to prosecute the case. And in many instances, the wounds that these individuals have suffered, the immigration system rubs salt in them because their credibility is constantly on trial. So all this is to say that closing or opening the border will not fix the flaws in the immigration system itself or by itself constitute an immigration policy. But that is the spotlight of attention of our political debate and a leading issue in the presidential campaign. And confronting it has real consequences for those who are forced to approach it. So I'm going to talk a bit about border security. I'm going to zoom out even more because I think the historical context of how are we here, what are some of the drivers are important in identifying how history tells us how we got here, and then end on some hopeful notes, particularly here in our local community. All right, so what has happened at the border? The border has been an intense focus of the last 5 presidential administrations, and border security refers to law enforcement and the law enforcement enterprise that's intended to prevent illegal border crossings and apprehend those who enter the United States without authorization. But is there more to it? Now, the Migration Policy Institute wrote an article largely written by Department of Homeland Security insiders, a lot of former Customs and Border Patrol officers but really sought to analyze the border policy over the course of the last 4 decades. And some of the questions they've asked are, is the story one of an inhumane and continuous militarization of the border, or is it a failure by multiple administrations to effectively control migration into the United States while addressing serious security challenges? How is it that the US government has been so challenged by the situation for so long? And after decades of major investments, which we'll get into, in border security, how is the country now facing levels of irregular migrants arriving at the southern border? And why is controlling it so hard? Some of the research and findings in that report are included here today, but as I mentioned, I want to take a historical context that's really overlooked in this report. I watched your last presenter in September and really appreciated, she had a graphic of the right and left brain, and I see this Migration Policy Institute report, very left brain, really looking at it analytically. And I think, when we think about the debate about immigration, the debate about the border, and you look at where conservatives stand and where progressives stand, and the conservatives are looking at it in a very logical numbers model, and the progressives see the human, and we haven't figured out how to talk to each other in order to make solutions that are humane and practical for our country. So there's a little bit of both in here. So. This is what's come to be a symbol of illegal migration, and a little history on that. These signs started coming up in about 1992. San Diego and El Paso were both seeing unprecedented numbers of migrants that were crossing the border. In San Ysidro, California, the Tijuana border, the port of entry, people were crossing and cars were getting stuck by people just crossing the Interstate 5, and so that's the origin when they started putting up these signs. A couple years later was ironically the first time that I was on a plane, number one, and went to San Diego and Tijuana. I went to Catholic high school, and really I think a lot of what brought me into this work were mission trips that I took with my school, and my first one was to San Diego and Tijuana. And that was 2 months after they passed Proposition 187 in California. That really was one of the first state responses to curb access to the social safety net that exists in the United States for migrants. I hadn't really realized, I heard it on the news, wasn't fully absorbing like how this fit into the plan, but definitely got to see the border firsthand, and really not realizing that this was just the start of a large construction and a large movement to really try to keep people out of our country. A couple years after that, I was in Guatemala, and it was a few months after they signed the peace accords from the Civil War in Guatemala, and we were going down there as a mission trip. Worked with some of you might know the New Ulm congregation here in Minnesota has a close relationship to those in Antigua. So we worked with children, with the indigenous community there, planting coffee trees and helping construct the buildings that would be the Godchild Project, now known as Common Hope, that's based here in Minnesota. And Guatemala is one of the places where I will start, because the covert operations that the United States engaged in Guatemala and El Salvador were really one of the most critical starts to the major flows, particularly at the southern border. Some of you in the room may have firsthand memories of migrants coming during that era, maybe also connected to learning that really many things that we learned out of World War II. We crafted the Refugee Convention. It was a victory for democracy, but the Cold War that followed also brought these U.S. covert operations that aided in overthrowing governments that even had a whiff of communism. The U.S. had a heavy hand in the 1954 overthrow of the populist Arbenz government in Guatemala, and in 1979, the coup d'etat of President Carlos Humberto Romero of El Salvador. And in the decades that followed that was the Civil War that brought many migrants from Central America to the United States. In 1980, the U.S. codified the Refugee Convention in our Refugee Act, making it a law and creating policies to allow people to access the asylum system in the United States. It was estimated that between 1981 and 1990, 1 million Salvadorans and Guatemalans fled the repression and economic instability and entered the United States. Yet the United States granted only 2.6 of the asylum applications for Salvadorans and 1.8 of the Guatemalans that sought protection here in the United States. So that's a really important point that we'll continue to circle back on, but just seeing the numbers, the way that those asylum seekers were handled, and how we have not learned our lessons from how those individuals were treated. A lot of the asylum seekers, in 1990, there was a temporary protected status that was given to Salvadorans that gave them temporary status, and then it wasn't until 2001, after a lot of litigation, that we had the law known as NACARA, which basically gave a path to permanent residence for individuals who had tried to access our asylum system in the 80s and 90s and were turned away. The other important event that happened in the 90s was in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement was created, and there was a free trade zone in North America, and really led to the demise of farming industry in Mexico and drove thousands and thousands of Mexicans, mostly adult males, to the United States without sufficient paths to work under US migration policy. Many migrants crossed illegally. Deciding to find work and send back money to feed families was more important than following laws in a border into a land that a large portion of it used to be theirs. So at this point in the mid-90s, sealing the border was a little too late, and instead the government responded to the influx of migrants and refugees by passing the Welfare Act of 1996, so really kind of taking that Proposition 187 from California and spreading it throughout the country and really restricting the ability of immigrants to access the social safety net that we have here in the United States. At the same time, there also were a number of challenges when you think about no access to social safety net, asylum seekers seeking protection but being denied. Around that time was when the psychologist added the post-traumatic stress disorder to the DSM, and acknowledging the impact of trauma and torture can have on one's mental health. And what we saw in many communities were a lot of refugees that were living with their children in substandard conditions and having to work a lot of jobs just to get by. And so what we saw at that time also was a rise in young people protecting themselves, getting involved in gangs. Specifically in Los Angeles, there was the MS-13 that really was formed out of Salvadorans defending themselves from Mexican gangs and cartels in that area. And so the other response for the US government was to get rid of the criminals. And so in 1996, we passed another law that added a whole list of violations that if someone committed certain crimes, they could be deported from the United States. We've continued to add to that list. We haven't taken anything off, but it just, as I mentioned, there's about 50 plus different reasons, several relating to crimes that that would get someone pushed out of the United States. So what that effectively did in the early 2000s is we saw many individuals get deported, many of them with gang connections, and we thought, all right, well, we've got rid of the criminals, everything's gonna be fine, just seal up the border, we're done. When in reality, what happened was a lot of those groups were then spending time in the countries they were deported to, many that were very young when they came to the United States, but over the course of the next decades, we have seen the Northern Triangle, so Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, really start to see organized crime infiltrate the governments, recruit children, terrorize families, and in the mid-2010s, those families and children started fleeing and coming to the US for protection. So history is repeating itself. The only challenge, I mean, there were different issues in the 80s and 90s that we were denying asylum, mostly related to our political stance and the fact that the governments they were fleeing were the ones that we were funding. But now, a lot of reasons that individuals fleeing gang violence, even domestic violence, is that it doesn't fit, or the government thinks it's sort of too many to fit into the confines of our refugee and asylum law that we have in the United States. And really haven't come up, again, with some other plan, some other path. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone needs an asylum, needs to fit the asylum definition, but that also doesn't mean our immigration policy can't create flexibility and ways to incorporate individuals, because there's no question that the violence that these families were fleeing was real. So these historical events are the backdrop and the forefront of what became an emerging border security policy, which effectively is this law enforcement enterprise intended to prevent illegal border crossings and more to process individuals that are arriving at the border. And instead of adapting our immigration policy by calculating for human movement that would come as a result of gutting economic sectors in Mexico and bankrolling wars in Central America, Congress tripled the Border Patrol's budget in the last decade of the 20th century, and then more than doubled it in the first decade of the 21st. So as you can see on this chart, it's very small, probably from where you are, but the Border Patrol budget in 1990 was just under $500 million, and now, well, this one goes up to 2017, but now it's beyond $4 billion a year. And this isn't to say there weren't efforts to try to reform the immigration system. In 2007, we had the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act. It included some border security. It had paths to permanent residence for those that have been in the US for 5 or more years. It had a temporary guest worker program. The DREAM Act, which was first introduced in 2001, for the one in this bill was specifically for students, a program for agricultural workers to adjust status, and even had some funding for Health and Human Services to provide health and education service to immigrants. Did not pass. Then we had another run at the DREAM Act in 2010. This one also, over the last 20 years, there's been at least 11 versions of the DREAM Act that's been introduced. But this one also had momentum, had some bipartisan support, but ultimately was 5 votes short of passing. And then in 2012, there was an executive order that was introduced by President Obama, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this was what we started to see a shift in Congress not passing anything, and now we see our executive office issuing executive orders. So the president said, well, if Congress is not going to do something, I have to do something. And so issuing these orders that try to be a fix, and we've seen this both in the interior and in border policy to just try to create something. And inevitably what often happens is then they're challenged in court, and right now we've got DACA is ruled to be not a lawful way to deal with immigration, carving out some exceptions for individuals that already have DACA, but definitely not an actual fix that sticks. And then in 2013, what was known as the Gang of Eight introduced another bill that that also was another attempt at comprehensive immigration reform, and really tried to create mechanisms that was a bipartisan bill and ultimately did not succeed. And I'll talk in a moment just about the most recent one, but this was sort of in that period where we're funding the border. There was also some, I don't want to ignore the attempts to try to make a fix. Doesn't want to listen to me. There we go. But the neglect to really get something passed was also, we also saw this really sort of, we have our immigration policy system, but then we also are seeing a parallel system sort of ballooning in the, specifically related to asylum seekers. And asylum seekers, and I'll also say it's tough to identify when these statistics are there are cases pending before the immigration court. The majority, I mean, when you're in immigration court, you can apply for any relief that's available. Asylum is one of them, but what we saw was this increase in the mid-2015. You see when that bolts up is around 2015, and a lot of those were Northern Triangle asylum seekers that were, once they make a credible fear claim, then they're allowed to enter the country, depending on what form of detention we're working with at the time, and then file for asylum in immigration court. And so in 2015, we saw a lot of asylum seekers from the Northern Triangle, and now more recently, we've seen South America, Ecuador, Venezuela, Caribbean, Haiti, and also not to mention a lot of asylum seekers coming from Africa to South America and then making their way up by land, a lot from Cameroon, for example. And so these border entrants are immediately funneled into the court system, and their caseload is increasing as the result of interior enforcement, both by President Obama and Trump, that prioritize apprehension of individuals with any sort of criminal history. And so those cases were also being put in the system. And so anyone who had filed their claim is living in limbo, constant shifting in the courts to try to schedule things, but really not having any sort of order. A lot of that because we created all this enforcement, we put people in the court system, but then we forgot to hire more judges. And you need a judge in order to make a decision in immigration court. So from 2011 to 2015, there was a stagnated number of immigration judges that were in our courts, and only in 2016 did we start to see that number come up, but now we're probably at around 600, and there's 3 million cases pending in our immigration courts today. So mass miscalculation in terms of cause and effect. And if you're going to have border enforcement, if you're going to apprehend people and put them in a court system, you should make sure that court system's prepared to handle them, which we weren't. And this is just one other slide, last graph for you, that shows you on the dark blue at the top is the funding for Customs and Border Patrol and Immigration and Custom Enforcement. So generally, CBP handles ports of entry and 100 miles from the border, and ICE is the enforcement in the interior. And then the middle line is the number of pending cases, and the one trailing on the bottom are the funding for the Executive Office for Immigration Review, which is where our immigration judges are. All right. So how is all the funding played out in the lives of those that are interacting with the border? In essence, the miscalculations in funding has created the optics of chaos. People already in the system are waiting for their day in court, while pressure mounts to deal with new arrivals expeditiously. And what's happened isn't an orderly process of what's on the court's docket for those in the interior, but rather in a persistent hyper-focused on maximizing the haphazardly process that's going on for new border entrants. So we constantly see in the media the newest version of how we're handling the border. And not only did bipartisan compromise break down on comprehensive immigration policy, the two major parties no longer came together on border policy, creating even more fissures. So though Obama was responsible for the initial family detention in Artesia, Mexico, where we had families living in tents in New Mexico and bonds at $50,000 and really no real access to any legal counsel, we see parties have really been divided on the issue, with the Democrats generally arguing for more humane processing and Republicans taking a harder line, villainizing the border entrants, and doing everything in their power to not only to keep them out. And so both parties have an interest to keep the cameras on the border in hopes that the perception of control, if they are the ones in power, will be what's portrayed. And if you're not in power, you want to make it look really chaotic because you can come in and fix it, is kind of the tagline. And it is true that the numbers of arrivals is staggering. Encounters with migrants rose 1.7 million in fiscal year 2021, 2.4 million in 22, and 2.5 million in fiscal year 2023. But I think, as I've tried to show today, we can't say we didn't see it coming, and we can't say we didn't have the power to solve it. So just a few of the different border policies that have been tried and challenged. We have the zero tolerance policy that really criminally prosecuted suspected illegal border crossers. And what this also added to was that really was the cause of family separation, because individuals are being criminally prosecuted, the adults, but children can't be held in criminal custody, so they took the children away from the parents and separated them, and then have still many cases where they have not yet been reunited. We also saw under the Trump administration, there was an attempt to end domestic violence as a plausible claim to asylum, really sort of blanketing, ending that, flooring refugee arrivals as well, and sending the National Guard to the border, and then really being persistent at creating that physical wall, that border, as really kind of the optics to say that we are here in the fortress. And there's also been state responses as well. We've seen in Texas, of course, Operation Lone Star has been Governor Greg Abbott's passion the last few years in trying to, immigration is federal law, and this has been an attempt for the state to really try to enforce immigration law in the state. And in addition to trying to kick people out through state authorities, they're also pushing them in through the busing policies that we've seen as a result. And again, just all this is to highlight that a lot of the responses, because Congress can't reach a consensus, we've seen executive orders rather than congressional policymaking that has been the result, and really seeing just this cycle of having Band-Aids try to be made, good ones, bad ones, and then them going up and cycling through the court. So really, on the ground, it's been very confusing, because you have an executive order, and it's effective one day, and then a court does a temporary injunction the next day, and so it's very difficult for anyone working with individuals at the border, much less those that are trying to access our asylum system, to understand what is the policy on any given day. And then just a couple of the more recent examples. We've seen Title 42, which was the use of a health law to prevent people from entering the border during COVID. There were some exceptions to the ban of entry at that time for vulnerable individuals. We just actually the other day had an attorney, a grad from the U of M, who has done a lot of work at the border and was specifically working with these vulnerable populations during Title 42, Charlene DeCruz, and they just did a documentary that was featuring it. And one of the individuals that she was working with was from Cuba and had a illness that she had gone blind in one eye and was actively losing her vision in the other. And it took them dozens of times to present her case to show that she was vulnerable and should have been allowed to enter despite this Title 42. So there's a lot of advocacy in order to try to find humane treatment on an individual level, in addition to the litigation of challenging some of these orders in court as well. And then there was a specific asylum ban that has gone into effect under the Biden administration that really restricts individuals who entered the United States and somewhere other than a port of entry after May of 2023, and also forcing people to seek asylum in the countries that they traveled through before they come to the United States, with some minimal exceptions, and not acknowledging the fact that many of those countries are dangerous to go through themselves. And then finally, we had the border bill that was introduced in October and was not successful, but again, was the closest that we've gotten to a bipartisan approach on that. It was enforcement-centric. I think a lot of those who work in advocacy for migrants are a lot of problematic pieces of it, but nonetheless, it did not pass as well, or either. So what is the path forward, and have we identified, what have we identified in terms of what have gone wrong? Can it be fixed? Should it be fixed? There is an organization, really sort of a coalition of some nonprofits that came up with these guidelines for a better border policy. And really, I think that there's many people that really are looking for a more comprehensive, progressive paths for people to come in, where this policy really looks at kind of gets into the weeds on the way that people are being processed and tries to make suggestions on how things can be better. So things like funding processing, there's certain Customs and Border Patrol officers that do processing at the border rather than patrols that are shooting at them. Funding welcome centers instead of gatekeeper traps. There's been a lot of efforts to try to connect and government with nonprofits, with faith communities, to try to provide welcome centers so that our enforcement branch isn't the one holding people at some of these facilities before they might be eligible for release. Supporting coordination among those different groups rather than structural changes to our asylum law that makes it more challenging to access. Providing shelter and services rather than the walls and surveillance. Funding legal representation rather than detention. Odds are, if you have an attorney, you'll have much better odds for success in your case, and much more likely that you're going to show up to court if you have an attorney, rather than funding oftentimes private prisons to detain immigrants. And then also the funding community-based support rather than surveillance. We have been working throughout the state with individuals that have been trying to navigate the surveillance systems. They have phones that, there was a woman in Florida that came, and we were meeting with her in St. Cloud, and she had this phone that they had given her, and she's been trying to call them and email them. She said, I have to give back the phone or they're going to charge me. And that was the focus. That's what she had to focus on while she was trying to, her legal case or a lot of her other basic needs were secondary because she was told that she needs to guard that phone with her life. There was another gentleman who had an ICE check-in at ICE office in Indiana, and he was here in Minnesota, and he tried to call them to tell him he was in Minnesota, see if they would change it. They didn't answer. They didn't respond to his emails. So he drove to Indiana. They didn't even answer the door. And so he took a picture of himself in front of the ICE office, like, I came here like you told me to. So I think there's just a lot of examples of individuals just trying to follow, this attempt at surveillance, thinking that people are trying to abscond when really they're trying to access their right to seek asylum in the U.S. And then, of course, funding support for unaccompanied children rather than detaining families. And finally, looking at some of the regional solutions instead of outsourcing removal and using funds that are intended for economic stability funds in different countries that are now being used to help with deportation, really prevent people from accessing asylum, looking at a lot of these regional networks, the humanitarian, UNHCR, International Organization for Migration, and how can they be used to really stabilize folks and allow them to help access the right to seek asylum and protection in another country. All right, so I ended up having a lot more slides on the sad stuff, but there's a few that I have, and I know I'm running out of time, but just a couple examples that I want to give from Minnesota. And I think really one of the silver linings that we have seen in a really restrictive time in our federal immigration law is how our communities have stepped up. We've seen when I was working at the Advocates, when the Trump administration started issuing orders and really restricting things at a greater level, we had places like Hennepin County that now funds legal representation for individuals in immigration court. We'd gone decades just giving people the minimal representation when they go before the judge if they're detained, and now can provide, that funding has helped the nonprofits provide full representation to individuals who can't hire attorneys and don't have money to hire attorneys. And guess what? We're winning. People are winning their cases, and the government's not appealing. Like, it's a real testament to the power of legal representation, how important it can be to individuals, and how important it is for our communities to put that support and saying the federal government might be removing you, but these are members of our community, and many times have been living here for decades, have family, have ties, and deserve to have due process and a fair chance in court. A few other examples. I know that there's a lot, and maybe touch on a couple here locally, but I want to just mention three that are in greater Minnesota. One in Otter Tail County in northwest Minnesota, Pelican Rapids. In 1993, they founded this multicultural committee that helps immigrants transition. It's a very small town, but a very mighty committee that they have that really focuses on welcoming people. And it's bread and butter type welcoming and having meals together and celebrating the diversity in their community. And a lot of, a really important part for a lot of these communities that would not exist if immigrants weren't coming to them. And so making that welcoming is really important. In southwestern Minnesota, Worthington was known for the Swift raids, the Swift meatpacking plant. In 2006, there were immigration raids there that swept up lots of parents while they're at work. The kids came home on the bus. The parents have been deported. Real bad press all over on that, and really detrimental consequences for a lot of those families. But just last year, Worthington's done a lot of work, and they continue to have a lot of immigration, largely related to the drawn to the meatpacking plants that are there. But they were their welcoming corps was the first one to receive a refugee family through the new private sponsorship program. So they welcomed a family from Congo just last year. And then in southeastern Minnesota, in Austin, they had a feature that they included into their city government. They had what was called an honorary council member position, where local residents can apply for a 4-month position really to shadow the city government. They would attend council meetings, committee meetings, and also get behind the scenes. They get emails that went to city council members, receive correspondence. And one of these individuals that applied and received this was Obala Obala, who won a seat on the Austin City Council just a year after becoming a U.S. citizen. And he's the first person of color to win an elected seat in this town of 25,000 people, and it's a 150-year history. So I think that's another example of the importance of welcoming people, but then quickly allowing them a channel to use their voice to help craft what is our future of our community. And I think we also have other examples of Minnesota is represented by immigrants. We, of course, have Ilhan Omar in our U.S. House of Representatives, the Minnesota House elected in 2022, Samaka Hussein, and then the Minnesota Senate, Zaina Mohammed, who immigrated at the age of 9. She's the youngest woman to serve in the Minnesota legislature, and she's in our Senate. And then just last year, St. Louis Park elected Mayor Nadia Mohammed, who is the first Somali American to be mayor of a town, of a city in the United States. And all of them migrated before they were teenagers. So I think also emphasizes the importance of our schools, the importance to welcome and receive our refugee children as our own and make sure that they thrive and that they lead us into the future in a place that they feel welcome in. So I know I'm just going to put these up here, but we're going to open to questions, but I know there were a couple opportunities to help. Just a few that I'll mention. The Immigration Court Monitoring Project is a collaboration between the Binger Center for New Americans and the Advocates for Human Rights. And it is an opportunity not just to observe immigration court, but to be a human rights fact finder. A lot of the information that they gather in observing detained court, the children and family docket, some of the non-detained immigration court is written up in reports, and the court's very receptive, and they take the feedback that's coming from those observers and trying to make their system better, hold their judges accountable, and so that's a really great way to get involved. If you speak another language, both the Advocates for Human Rights and the Binger Center have volunteer interpreter programs. And then something that happened in 2016, the International Association for Refugees came to town. They work in a number of different places, and they asked our community here of service providers, what do you need? What do asylum seekers and refugees need? And we said, housing, housing, housing. So they started the Jonathan Project, which houses asylum seekers, and then they also partnered with the Advocates for Human Rights to create a Minnesota Asylum Network. As many of you have maybe worked with refugee resettlement agencies that work with refugees that are resettled, this program is focused more on those asylum seekers because they can't access all those benefits. They aren't recognized as refugees until they've gone through the process. And I showed you the chart with the immigration court, just how long it takes. It can take years, if not more than decades, for people to reach that status. And so this network is a way to really kind of share ideas and support for individuals that are on that journey so that they can remain hopeful. So with that, I thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Barb. Any questions? We'll stay here.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a sort of impossible task to, cover the history of immigration law in the United States in a very short period of time. So a couple housekeeping announcements. One, we are going to have people passing baskets for donations, which we appreciate to keep this Tegater talk process alive. And also, we're going to be passing out some sign-up sheets for some of these volunteer opportunities, some that Sarah mentioned and other ones, different kinds of things. There's a actual dinner here on March 17th in our Garvey Hall downstairs, where people are going to gather for dinner with some recent immigrants to talk about their experiences. So those of you who kind of want to engage on a more personal basis, those are some opportunities. So and then I'm going to pass the mic. I'm going to walk around with a mic. I'm Oprah Winfrey Cabrini, but before I start passing the mic, so you should be thinking of your questions if you don't have them already. Sarah, I wondered if you would do just a couple definitional things that I think will help people. One is, can you talk about, you were just talking about asylum and refugee, could you talk about the distinction between asylees and refugees? And there's a number of people in this parish and through other opportunities who have been hosting, for instance, Afghani refugees. And I know, like, the Advocates has been real involved in that project, and the formerly known as American Refugee Committee, now ALITE. So just that fundamental distinction.
Sure. So essentially, asylees and refugees, both the same definition, refugee definition applies to both. So you're outside your country of origin and you have a well-founded fear of persecution based on your race, religion, nationality, membership in particular social group, or your political opinion. The one distinction is that refugees go through that process outside of the United States and then would be resettled. And so they would come in with refugee status, access to work authorization, access to some of the social safety net. Asylum seekers are those who are in the United States. They may present themselves at the border that you see here. They might cross the border. You just have to be present in the United States to apply for asylum. And then it's our domestic law that you have to, you have the burden to show that you meet the refugee definition. And so there's what's called an affirmative asylum process that's very bureaucratic, and you meet with an officer in an office, and then this defensive one before the immigration judge. And typically, those arriving at the southern border have to go before the judge. There is a carve out for kids that they get to go before the asylum office first. I think the other thing too, for the Afghans, it was a very rapid evacuation process. There was a decision that there wasn't enough time for many to actually go through the refugee process. So a lot of that was one of the really big issues when the Afghans were evacuated and came to the United States, and many were given parole, which is this: you're physically allowed to be in the United States, but you are legally not here yet, or legally not admitted. And I was at Advocates at the time. We were working with a whole coalition of legal service providers, and we said, okay, we'll work this out, have everybody at the ready, because the Afghan Adjustment Act is going to pass real quick, and that's going to make it really easy because it's a no-brainer. Like, they can't not have consensus on adjusting Afghans, and that's failed 3 times even. So the Afghans that are arriving, there are some special immigrant visas, particularly for those who were doing interpretation, but the Afghans have to go through the asylum process. And so it's another one that's just adding to the backlog and putting people through this grueling process of having to talk about their persecution and fitting into that little.
Great. And for asylum applicants, when do they get work authorization? Because this is one of these problems, is the length of the system is such that people often aren't allowed to work for a long time.
Yeah, so in general, 150 days after you've filed your asylum application, you can apply to get a work permit. So it usually would arrive within 6 months. There have been some programs in paroling individuals, and some of those provisions also allow people to apply for a work permit. So we've seen, some of the Venezuelans that have arrived are able to apply for a work permit immediately under the parole provision. But again, it's for asylum, that's the pretty consistent part. The processing is always unpredictable.
Okay. And then we wanted to talk, there are a number of us who, we've been following the decisions of especially from Florida and Texas, to send busloads of people to blue states. Mm-hmm. But we're not getting those in Minnesota, are we right?
Well, not the flashy ones that are covered on the media. I think the numbers, I know like some of our city offices have been monitoring numbers, and I think it's like 300 to 400 a month or so. But
is that an increase?
I would say yes, but I think oftentimes because Hennepin County has helped with some of the sheltering pieces. I mean, I think a lot of times we've had people arrive on a pretty consistent basis. I mean, in the last 10 years, like our intakes at the Advocates, I think they're like, it used to be, you get 300 people that would call a year, and now it's like 13,000 or some really extreme number of people calling for assistance. So I think the numbers are increased, but I think part of that also is because people are now noticing and trying to provide assistance too. So.
Okay, and then finally, could you give us a sort of a sense of the demographic of those currently coming into Minnesota? What nationalities are we seeing represented the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think that lately there's been a lot more individuals coming from Ecuador, from Venezuela. A year ago when we would go, I remember there was it last summer, maybe 2 summers ago, we had a client who was from Nicaragua, and she said, can you come to the trailer park where I live because there's some people that want to talk to you. And I mean, she must have had 50 Nicaraguans that found their way to this small town and needed assistance. So currently, I would say we're seeing more Ecuadorians and Venezuelans. And also, I mean, it's a little hard to know as well, because when we've been out at the immigration court, some of the people that are having their first hearings, they entered 2 years ago. But the problem is they were given paperwork at the border, and then it's the government attorney that has to file the paperwork with the court to get things started, and their papers are stacking up. And so, it looks like people are just arriving from those countries when really, they came in a couple of years ago.
Right. Okay, and then just one final clarification. So the Somali community, they came in as refugees, largely.
Largely, yeah. I mean, there certainly are and have been Somali asylum seekers, but we certainly received a large portion of Somali. And now I don't know exactly. I know at one point we were anticipating receiving a number of refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know from our resettlement agencies, what the demographics are in terms of resettlement. But
and then the resettlement agencies here work with the federal, in tandem with the federal government.
Yeah.
So when there are groups of people come in, we get contracts here to do resettlement services and get people housing and jobs. And
Yep.
okay. All right. So I just wanted to get some of those basics out. So audience, I will come to you with the microphone.
Question, what about, I know we have people coming into Minnesota from Ukraine. Are they having to go through all the same kind of steps, or is it easier, harder? I know that a lot of them are being sponsored by families in Northeast Minneapolis by the Ukrainian Orthodox churches.
Yeah, there was also a special program for Ukrainians. A lot of them were arriving at the border, but then there's been parole programs for them. I don't know. I mean, I think there probably are numbers that are arriving as refugees, but a lot of times there's also this temporary protected status that the government can also issue, and a lot of times what that does is sort of pauses people from applying for asylum. I think it's a helpful Band-Aid, but again, is not a long-term policy, because people end up, I mean, it's basically getting you a work permit, but you're in limbo. It's not creating a permanent status. And another example of that is we had a large number of asylum seekers from Liberia that came into the United States, and at a certain point, temporary protected status was declared. A lot of people pursued that and just let their asylum, because if you just have a work permit and can continue to work, why are you going to put yourself through having to explain your whole persecution story to someone? Makes sense, but it then, once temporary protected status, and there was another, it's called deferred enforced departure, turned into that, and then they were ending it, and people had been here for 20 years, and they're like, well, now what? We've been here for 2 decades. We can't go home now. But there was no solution, and so actually Senator Smith's office worked with a lot of Liberian community advocates to get a special law that was created for Liberians, basically saying, oh yeah, we should have made it easier in the first place, because many of them had valid asylum claims. So that's kind of a long way to answer the question that, we're seeing that with Ukraine, so there probably aren't as many Ukrainian asylum seekers. I think the situation's a little different too, but that can be a double-edged sword.
Questions? Great.
I'm Kathy Iverson. We're members at St. Joan of Arc and part of Welcome the Stranger. We were with, actually, Dave with Casa Guadalupana last evening, and he pointed out one other thing that we never thought about, which is think about those folks that are coming in to our country that, say, have a professional degree, civil engineering, medicine, whatever. Is there a way that we can also create pathways for them to get back into that career in our country, rather than having, really essentially telling them they have to start over again? And our Senator Elise Mann is out in, she serves the Edina district. She's looking at, she's sponsoring a bill that would help facilitate doctors, physicians who are new to our country, to help them become providers. I mean, we're so short of doctors.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, Dave and I worked together on a project where we interviewed a lot of the clients at the advocates and former clients, and that was one of the things that came up. And I think, I think there's challenges in people finding work if, there are language barriers. But I think also, you find professionals that are severely underemployed. I mean, not to mention not being able to use their skills, but, for their mental health, or they're used to, having this trained skill to be able to use and share with others. And yeah, I think that's a very good point, and good to hear that there's a bill being presented on it.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Stein. I'm part of the Cabrini membership here, and I also work at Casa Guadalupana, so welcome. You spoke earlier about the difficulty in talking if you're on the left or on the right, and I'll just say I'm more on my left brain. I'm feeling so much compassion, and we must find a compassionate response. How do we talk to people who are really in their logical, do we have some good arguments, economic or any other kinds of arguments that don't involve compassion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge of the day, of trying to figure out how to speak to each other in ways. I mean, I think that example from the coalition of providers that was in one of the slides. I'm happy to share the article, because they have kind of a summary of it, and then point to some of the articles are really a lot more incremental and practical, and I think really trying to say what are ways that we can continue to make sure the border is secure, but make it more humane. And so conceding that, all right, people do need to process. Even though we would love to just open the doors and let everyone in, they've got to go through the process. But figure, who is doing that, and how much of is it a police law enforcement response, and how much is it sort of an economic? I think a lot of the economic arguments are what has driven a lot of the attempts to try to really negotiate on things, because in its history, the Immigration Service, it used to be under the Department of Labor, Department of Treasury, and then it wasn't until the mid-90s that we made it a criminal issue. It's administrative law. So I think getting back to some of those arguments are a potential path to try to find compromise.
There are some real labor arguments, right, that we're talking about here. We have a labor crisis, and certainly in the rural sectors, which is a lot of the places where we find undocumented workers are coming and working. And so you have this sometimes strange, not even quiet situation where some of the plants or big agricultural employers will tell people to recruit their friends back in across the border and have them come, but all the risk is on the immigrant, who will come in, who's looking for work, who just wants to work. So are there big employers who are standing up and trying to push for these changes in immigration laws?
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly are some of the employers. I know, Immigrant Law Center Minnesota, in the last few decades, the last several decades, that's been a really important partnership to find how business is connecting and collaborating with individuals to try to, because they do have a lot of sway in the political realm, and trying to get them on board to advocate. And I think there were, some successes in those efforts, at least a few years ago. Yeah.
Are we making any progress in helping alleviate the problems in other countries that we have contributed to. For climate change is making it hard to farm in higher elevations in, let's say, Ecuador. Guns from our country and use of drug use is fueling violence in many parts of Mexico. Repressive governments, because we frankly propped up governments that made it a hostile environment for people in other countries. How can we help address those push factors, they're called?
Yeah, well, and I know that in some of the proposals early in the Biden administration that, part of the responses included those looking at some of those push factors, and there've been investments, USAID has been involved in some of those, and trying to address situations in those different countries to try to alleviate some of the push factors. How successful they've been, I think, kind of depends, but I think it's certainly part of the calculation, and several administrations have tried to, kind of not say immigration is just here, but, I think one of the arguments I've made, we have more displaced people globally than we ever had. It's not stopping, and it's just embarrassing to be in the United States. Like, we're on our field. Like, how can you just creating a wall and keeping people out? It just looks like you're on your heels. There's no proactive plan. I think that's
Cheap grain, putting farmers out of business in Mexico because our trade policy allows us to dump.
and then not thinking, well, they're going to have to go somewhere for work. Like, put that in the calculation.
Necessarily a good idea to put people out of business in their own country. More fair.
Sorry, they can't hear. Did you want to finish that, Ann, or are you good? Okay, I saw hands over here.
Can I just, I just want to also plant one thing that I've been thinking about, thinking about global migration as a human rights issue, and kind of to the question about the professionals, because I think as global citizens, certainly as the United States, thinking about our immigration policy, but I think there's also, and this kind of goes to the other point as well in terms of supporting the other governments, that, when you think about extracting specifically professional labor from other countries. Like, part of me really wants to have people be able to use their degrees and be part of the United States, but it can also be seen as next level colonialism and saying we're brain draining the rest of the world. And I think there's a little pause on that, and it's a tension, because as an attorney, individual autonomy and agency for clients to choose where you want to live is important, but also as global citizens thinking about what is that impact of extracting humans from other places where they could be making those places a better place. And I think that complicates the calculation, but just something to ponder.
Hi. My name is Joe Chan from Lumen Christi Catholic Community in Highland Park.
Oh, yeah.
Before I ask my question, I want to share with something that I heard recently on NPR in their Hidden Brain program. They have a program, apparently they have 3 conversations on conflict resolution, and it's very fascinating. I have not listened to them. I only heard the tail end, and I thought, we all ask, how do we talk to other people on the extreme side of it? So I would highly recommend we're all trying to listen to that. My questions, I have 2 questions, is about constitutions. My shallow understanding, I have not done research, I just read something to the effect that immigration and border security is totally the responsibility of the federal government. But how they implement their policy, they do have some flexibility. Now, I really like the slide that you show about some of the border policy from the nonprofit organizations. The one thing that I really like too is about the regionalized approach. How much can the current president be able to utilize some of the power to implement some of those things? That's question number one. Question number two, what is the legal basis that Texas and Florida had to bus refugees across state line? I mean, how strong is their standing, legal standing on that? Those are my two questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think well, you're right on, immigration is federal law, and I think the policy, implemented through policy, there's actually a few cases before the Supreme Court. There's this sort of long-standing case called Chevron, which basically gives a lot of deference to agencies to interpret the statutes and create the policies, and that's very much up in the air. So, the way immigration law is created is the agency will take the statute and then write up, okay, we have one paragraph and here's 100 pages of policy of how we're going to implement it. And then there's a comment period. That's another way you can get involved. If you hear of the Federal Register and they're publishing new rules, anyone can comment on that. We spent a lot of time commenting on a lot of rules because there were a lot of rules under the Trump administration. That was one of the tactics, the specific tactic to really try to tweak policies, very deep in the books of the policy books on that. But so that's kind of up in the air on how much deference the agencies will receive on creating those policies. I think to the question of the president using regional tools, I think that, that's a really important way. I don't think it's getting a lot of press. I think oftentimes our Democrats that are in office disappoint us on immigration. I mean, it was Bill Clinton that signed the Welfare Act, and some of the opportunities and ways to create that collaboration is, the political will might not be there, but certainly within his power to try to collaborate with the international bodies that we're a part of. I think overall, the United States, especially on some of the human rights international conventions and things, we have not been a strong voice on, so that's been a challenge. And then in terms of the authority for the busing, I think the arguments that they have made is they've made it seem relatively voluntary, and I think there's really sort of been mixed responses from individuals because, number one, I don't know if I would want to stay in Texas if that's right, right? I mean, I think the reality is they're making it seem like everyone wants to live in Texas when a lot of people make their ways to other states already. And, so I think there's problems in sort of the most challenging. There were attempts to collaborate and say, yes, that's a great idea. We'll get ready. Let's coordinate with Texas. We'll take individuals and welcome here in our states that are more welcoming. And then he started to play games and dropping people off at 3 a.m. and really trying to intentionally make it less intentional. But I think overall that the argument has been there's a level that people are choosing to participate in the busing. I think there was the SB4 that has just been enjoined, and basically on the argument of a lot of the tactics there were really squarely falling into the area of federal law and trying to basically have the state of Texas deport people. So.
Hi, I'm Joanne from St. Cecilia's. We're kind of in the beginning stages of, well, I guess it's the second sponsorship. I have a couple questions. What is the expense actually for the families or whatever getting here? I mean, you hear crazy numbers. Also, you lawyers, are you volunteering your time and or are you do you have a pool of money to glean? And I'm also wanting to thank you for your time And are there notes available?
So can I just have you clarify your question? Are you sponsoring sort of a refugee like an Afghan or Ukrainian? Or is it somebody who is seeking asylum? You know,
Right now, we're looking at a refugee. Like I said, it's just beginning stages, and we need speakers and all that, you know, to get some people motivated.
So in terms of refugee resettlement, a lot of times communities work with the resettlement agencies, and you know, they have a very organized volunteer corps and a lot of clarity in terms of how people are supporting individuals. For those that are arriving asylum seekers, you know, the costs can vary depending on where they're coming from, how far they're going, but you know, it's not unusual for just you know, more than $10,000. A lot of people are, you know, selling their property, and you know, and then others that might be having to pay back those debts. Plus, it can also enter into kind of other legalities and problems for individuals. But usually, it's I would say, you know, easily thousands of dollars that people are paying just to get here to the United States. Let's see, I think you had 3 questions. One was lawyers. Yes, actually, one other thing, I skipped one of the slides here, but a couple of great things. I know for the Democrats, there were a lot of great things that came out of the last legislative session in Minnesota, but one of them was permanent funding for the Office of New Americans. That is now part of deed in the state. And then there was also a bill that had Minnesota state funding for legal services and social services. So a lot of the nonprofits that are providing free legal services are tapped out to the max. So there's some coordination among them to try to use those funds to provide additional legal services. There's also been a movement for accredited representatives that can go through training. They're not lawyers, but if they're trained through the Board of Immigration Appeals, they can represent individuals and provide certain assistance. And those are also need to be embedded in a nonprofit that doesn't necessarily have to do legal services. They do have to have a lawyer that's mentoring them and things. So there are some resources available. In the Binger Center, we do a very small number of cases, but we don't charge for our services, and we work with law students that represent individuals in a few different areas of immigration law. But a lot of what we've been doing and talking with people out in the community, and we do some pro se assistance. The courts also created a new rule last year, because it used to be you were all in on the case. You're either representing somewhere or you weren't. And so you'd basically signing up for a decade of working with someone, or you just say that you can't help. And, you know, there were rules on you even be able to help someone fill out a form. Now they have another way that someone can really get brief services just to get the application filed. And then hopefully we'll be able to get a work permit and hire an attorney before they have that final hearing. So that, you know, more what we call brief assistance is another way that someone might be able to hire a lawyer for a more discrete part of their case. But a lot of the talks that we've been giving to people is really trying to help them navigate trying to hire a lawyer, facing the reality that, you know, legal services for those who, even if they would meet the income criteria, there's just a lack of capacity at this point.
My name is John, and I'm a member also of St. Joan of Arc and Welcome the Stranger, and I'm also a member of Interfaith Coalition on Immigration, which, oh, I'm sorry, thank you very much. So I'll try to be brief, if that's possible. But it's nice to see some of the things that are on that we're doing in Minnesota. But the interfaith, last year, I think we all probably realized that one of the great things that happened here was that we passed a law in Minnesota that immigrants can get driver's licenses. And that you know, and that was, I was very proud of our Archbishop Hebda, because several years ago, he shocked me when I was in a meeting in the, at the Capitol, and somebody asked him to come, and he spoke about saying, passing this law is a moral imperative. I was surprised he didn't say that in Latin to make it even more powerful. You know, that would really, you know, that would probably get to the Vatican even. But, it took him several years to do it, but he was sitting there last year when they passed it, and he was standing next to our governor in pushing this through, and it did, but it took a number of years. There's another one, and it's noted up there, called the North Star Act, and maybe you could probably explain it better than I could, what it involves, but it is an act that is actually on the dockets now in the Minnesota legislature. So it's something that we can support, and we will need support for that. And that Interfaith Coalition has been involved with that. So I'm always, if I would have known even getting this deep, I would have brought some materials that you could pass out. But encourage your senators and representatives to support that. And last thing I'll say is the Interfaith Coalition has been doing this on a regular for years now. On the second Tuesday of the month, we do a vigil, a prayer vigil, in front of Bishop Whipple's federal building at Fort Snelling. So, and the gentleman in Casa Guadalupana will be doing that this on March the 13th. The first Tuesday of the month at 7:30. You're all welcome to join us, and it's very easy to get to. Or we'll give you some materials for the, if you want to just sit home and watch it on, because it is video, it is streamed by. And finally, I will ask you if Trump becomes president. Now I'm getting political. Far be it for me to be political. But if Trump becomes president, and some of the things he says, and we know Liz Cheney believes every word he says, that he will do what he likes, he'll at least try. What would be our legal response to that if he said, I'm going to do what Adolf Hitler did in the 30s and rounded up all sorts of people and just kicked them out of put them in jail or detention or something like that? Is there a way to legally a way to object to that?
Well, I mean, I think we saw a lot of that in the first round, and I think there's been kind of a dual response. There've been lawyers that were representing individuals that were, put into proceedings, and then there was a lot of impact litigation and a lot of looking at what is the executive order, what is the authority that he claims to have, and challenging them in our courts. I mean, I think our courts are different than they were under the first administration, but a lot of the, there's, when we talk to our law students and kind of like the different types of lawyers you can work with an individual client on their case, or you can, make arguments at the Supreme Court, and there's different skills in both of those areas, and I think, not to brag about my own profession, but I think the role of lawyers has been really critical in trying to dig into what authority there may or may not be, and some of the actions that might be taken, and then challenging them. And I think people will be hopefully had some rest, but be fired up to try to defend those, anticipate hopefully, and advocate on behalf of human beings once again. So, and then, yes, to the North Star Act, I also, there are some flyers that I have on the North Star Act here, but essentially it's a creating a sanctuary state in Minnesota, so sort of doing the opposite of Texas and saying we are not here to enforce immigration law, and looking at ways that we can advocate to say this is the role of the state. We can't prevent the federal government from enforcing their immigration laws, but we don't have to do it for them. And so there's some specific provisions there included in the act. And actually, tomorrow, I think Minnesota Freedom Fund has a day at the lobby or a day on the Capitol to talk about North Star Act. And Minnesota Freedom Fund is another really fantastic organization that started by raising funds to pay for both criminal and immigration bonds. And so they've been a really important partner for individuals to be able to get released from immigration detention, and are also doing important advocacy work. And they have another observation court monitoring program in criminal court as well, if you're interested in that area.
Okay, we're going to have two more questions. One is right here, and then the other one is going to be over there. And then the rest of you, I'm sure Sarah will stay around afterwards and be available to talk. I'm thrilled that there's so much enthusiasm for questions.
But it is still a nice day out, so we want
yeah,
to make sure you can
cognizant
see a
of
nice
a
sunset
Sunday
in warm
afternoon.
weather.
So here you go.
Thank you. You mentioned in the beginning that there are about 3 million cases backlog. Now, by cases, what are you referring to? Asylum cases, refugee cases, or all of them together?
It's all of them, basically 3 million individuals that have a removal or deportation case, and so they're presenting
All right,
their
there's
defense, which might be asylum, but not.
and there's 600 immigration judges appointed by,
Well, anyone can apply to become an immigration judge, and then it's not an Article III courts. They're not appointed. They are hired by the Attorney General, and they're part of
are
Department
they
of
required to be attorneys?
What's that?
Are they required to be attorneys?
I do think they don't need to be immigration attorneys, but would need to be an attorney. An asylum officer doesn't necessarily have to be an attorney, but.
And the reason I bring that up, about 5 or 7 years ago, I'm an attorney, and I received, and I don't know if it came through the University of Minnesota Law School where I went, but asking for being a pro bono attorney in immigration. And I was just in the process of almost retired, and I jumped at the chance along with a lot of other friends of mine. We got all kinds of paperwork, got everything filled up, applied, never heard from anybody, never once. And finally I called and said, you know, I applied 2-3 years ago and I never heard from anybody. What's going on? And they said, well, do you speak Spanish?
Oh.
And I said, no, I don't speak Spanish. It didn't say that on the application that I had to speak Spanish. Well, no, we don't need you if you can't speak Spanish. And so I keep thinking about this backlog all the time of cases. It's because we don't have enough judges? Is it because we don't have enough attorneys? Or what is causing this backlog that we keep hearing about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a significant increase in cases. They are hiring more judges at our court. We've seen a number of them be added. And there have been some other attempts to try to adjust the way that cases are heard. And, you know, they used to have these sort of preliminary hearings for everyone. And now if you have an attorney, you don't need to have those hearings. So, you know, some specific time-saving techniques. But I think the other piece that's been underutilized is prosecutorial discretion, that the government can decide if they want to settle a case or concede to a point, or not appeal a case if the judge has ruled in someone's favor. But I think what we've seen is there's, you know, and that a lot of times is guided by the executive office. The Attorney General at the time will, you know, direct when is prosecutorial discretion used and kind of send out memos on how to prioritize cases. And we've seen ebbs and flows in that. And we're actually at a time where there's a little more openness to that. So if people have, you know, you can apply for certain immigration benefits with the immigration service that the judge can't even grant. And so if you're considered a lower priority, you haven't entered recently, some of those cases are being basically pulled off the court's docket. And actually, we've seen a lot of the kids that were coming in 2015 are now getting prosecutorial discretion, so, and are able to apply for other benefits, or sometimes they might not even have something else available, and the government will agree to terminate their proceedings. It doesn't get anyone status, but at least it takes the immigration case off the court's docket. So it's complicated.
So before the last question, I just want to remind people there's some handouts here. If some of the volunteer opportunities on those sheets were interesting to you, these are ways to connect with them. And among those are working, are contacting the Advocates for Human Rights, which does use pro bono lawyers. So if there are lawyers in the crowd who are actually looking to volunteer, Sarah or I could connect you. But there's a lot of things for people with different skill sets. So feel free to take one of those. And our final question.
My name is Mike Menzel, also from St. Joan of Arc. I was at a town hall meeting earlier this week with Senator Elise Mann, who sponsored the North Star bill. And correct me with this, but the terminology of calling the North Star a sanctuary bill has been very harmful to the movement of this really incredible piece of legislation, and it's going to hamstring the progress on this in a way that it's going to be dead in the water before it can move forward. And it's really not creating a sanctuary state in Minnesota. It's is my understanding.
Yeah, I think the more technical term is, and we've used this also in the city concepts, a separation ordinance, that really sort of like separating the roles and saying, these are duties under our authority in the state, or, for the cities that have done it, these are the responsibilities that we have, and it's separate and apart from what the federal government might do. And so, I mean, I agree. I've had this, I was at another meeting and they were using the sanctuary movement, but I think with certain audiences, it is definitely a buzzword. But if you are interested, and this kind of goes to the historical piece too, but there's a part of a chapter of a very long book, but good book, called Everyone Who's Gone Is Here by Jonathan Blitzen. He's a New York Times journalist, but he did an interview with on Fresh Air, and has written this book that is really kind of, I was drawing on a lot of those historical contexts and bringing it to the present border. He wrote a book on it, and there's a great section on the original sanctuary movement that was really involved in providing humanitarian services for those asylum seekers that were coming from Central America in the 80s and 90s, and that sort of inspired some of these, but I agree that technically it's more separation ordinance would be, or the state version, the ordinance would be the city version, but really sort of separating the duties between state and federal government. And I also should have noted, I also go to St. Joan of Arc, so.
She goes to St. Joan of Arc. Well, on behalf of St. Francis Cabrini and the Tegeter Talks, thank you so much, Sarah, for bringing your knowledge and your passion about this issue to share with us today.